Okay, I want to welcome everybody today and thank you for joining us for this Wagner Society of Northern California webinar. We're extremely excited today to have Katherine Syer back with us. It's been quite some time. I think it was right about the time of James Conlon coming on board down in Los Angeles that you were with us last, and that's been some time. There's even been a ring in there in the meantime. So it's really great to have you back. Katherine is now a professor at UCLA, so she's very close to us now, coming here from the Midwest. So anyway, before joining the faculty at UCLA, Katherine taught opera and theater history and production, research methods and dramaturgy, and special topic courses at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where she most recently served as director of graduate studies. And Dr. Syer's work on Wagner's creative development and legacy has been published in the Wagner Journal, Musical Quarterly, Wagner and His World, and a companion to Wagner's Parsifal. Sorry, her monograph, Wagner's Visions, Poetry, Politics, and the Psyche of Operas through Die Walküre, appeared in 2014 on Boydell and Brewer. She has offered production-related presentations for Wagner Societies in Northern California, New York, Chicago, as well as at international scholarly conferences. So with no further ado, I will give you Katherine Syer. Thank you and welcome. I'm going to shut myself off now so you can have the screen to yourself. And here we go.
Excellent. Thank you, Terry, for inviting me to join you and supporters of the Northern California Wagner Society for this webinar series. Let me also warmly thank Emma Popek, whose support for the audiovisual side of this presentation has been both invaluable and enjoyable. Today, I will take the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth, marked last year, as a launching pad from which we can revisit Wagner's appreciation of Beethoven and his contribution to another anniversary, namely the 1870 centennial of Beethoven's birth. We will consider the contours and context of the substantial essay Wagner penned that year and published under the title Beethoven. I will also consider ways we might fruitfully link some of the ideas expressed in that ambitious and eclectic essay to Wagner's artistic practices reaching back to his formative years. Let us ease our way into our main material with a few thoughts about anniversaries of well-known composers such as Beethoven. They often stimulate widespread attention and activity, from specialized circles to more public arenas. One only need think of the bright spotlight on Wagner around 2013, the 200th anniversary of his birth. The Beethoven year 2020 was, alas, one of the many victims of the ongoing pandemic. Countless celebratory events, especially those involving large theatrical and instrumental ensembles, have been canceled. As we continue to discover fresh and safe ways we can share our love of the performing arts, let us hold fast to the core sentiment of Leonora's aria Komm Hoffnung, Come Hope, in Beethoven's opera Fidelio. In the face of adversity, let us maintain hope. A quick personal note. Almost 20 years ago, I offered a series of lectures throughout the Bay Area on the production history of Fidelio for the San Francisco Opera Guild. I remember it well, not least of all because it was my first extended time away from the first of my two daughters. That daughter learned to walk one summer in Bayreuth and began attending live performances of The Ring in Germany when she was 6. She is now a physics major at UCLA, and her boyfriend tried really hard to impress her when they first met by telling her he had attended the entire LA Ring. My younger daughter attended her first complete Ring in Munich with her stuffed pig proudly resting on the velvet-covered ledge of the conductor's loge. Kent Nagano had kindly shared his private box with 2 families with children, whose eager faces greeted all who looked to the side of the stage from the house. Such an image of hope. Back to Beethoven and Wagner. Regarding Beethoven anniversaries, we are tangibly reminded of the 75th anniversary of his birth by the commemorative statue, which still stands in front of the former post office in Bonn, his native city. Such monolithic forms of representation are historically significant, but sometimes considered out of step with modern sensibilities, as is suggested by the recent art installation by Ottmar Hörl, set in place for the Beethoven year 2020. In addition, the city of Bonn supported a walking tour guiding people to places significant to the composer's youthful years spent there. The tour actively engages people with Beethoven's world, as does the imaginatively redesigned museum on the outskirts of Vienna at Heiligenstadt. It was there in October 1802 that Beethoven addressed in the form of a confessional letter a personal, artistic, and political crisis, as well as his desire to move beyond such challenges, hope in the face of adversity. The letter was first discovered amongst his belongings a few months after Beethoven's death and is now known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. One of the rooms in the renovated Heiligenstadt Museum is devoted to Beethoven's deafness, offering visitors different ways to imagine and approximate the experience of deafness themselves. Beethoven's legacy, as is well known, has cast a long shadow. For the 1870 centennial, the Royal Philharmonic in London programmed all of Beethoven's symphonies. The Society was subsequently offered a bust of the composer that would become a visual mainstay of all their concerts starting the next year, placed in front of the orchestra as an emblem of artistic creativity and achievement. Commemorative busts, like full-body monuments, carry about them a whiff of the past, of something frozen in time. For some, this might imply a kind of enduring significance. For others, a rigidity which ignores the winds of change. And sometimes, let's face it, busts mostly accumulate dust with other knickknacks and scarcely invite reflection. The bust of Beethoven in Joseph Danhauser's 1840 painting, Liszt Fantasizing at the Piano, commands attention. Here we see Liszt playing a piano crafted by Konrad Graf, who commissioned the painting. The fictional Parisian salon features recognizable personalities framing the pianist, who gazes in rapture at the larger-than-life bust of Beethoven as he plays. Just as the painting does not depict an actual gathering, the Graf piano and bust of Beethoven suggest a departure from reality. The piano seems to extend into the exterior realm beyond the window, framed theatrically by voluminous drapery. Furthermore, upon close examination, the large bust rests in unlikely fashion on a pile of papers, sandwiching a bound book. Challenging a straightforward reading of this imagery is the way Danhauser painted the upper outline of the landscape in the distance, so that it blends in with the top sheaths of paper underneath the bust. The net effect is not of something heavy, obeying the laws of gravity, but rather of something floating mysteriously in the realm of imagination and inspiration. The image of Beethoven thus gains a dynamic, transcendent aura. As we know, Liszt would become a key figure in Wagner's life and career. At the time of Danhauser's painting, Liszt had banked over a decade of successful performances in Paris, connecting along the way with the guests at this imaginary salon. In the painting, Liszt and his music making are as much the focus of rapturous attention as the symbolically laden bust of Beethoven. By contrast, Wagner, who was himself in Paris in 1840, had yet to capture much public attention. Frustrated in his efforts to make his mark as a composer, he tried to make ends meet as an arts journalist. The same year as Danhauser's painting, we find Wagner expressing his own fascination with Beethoven in the form of the novella A Pilgrimage to Beethoven, in part influenced by a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony he had heard in Paris months earlier. In the novella, a quasi-autobiographical composer undertakes a fictional journey to Vienna to meet his musical and ideological hero. The novella was first published in installments in French during the final weeks of 1840, before appearing in German the following summer. Several aspects of Wagner's novella reflect the penetrating influence of E.T.A. Hoffmann, not least of all the shaping of characters so as to give voice to the beliefs of the author, in this case, Wagner. Additionally, Hoffmann wrote two very influential essays about Beethoven, one a review of the Fifth Symphony, and we should note that his first publication, Ritter Gluck or Knight Gluck, from 1809, involves a mysterious ghost-like figure who claims to be the long-dead composer, Christoph Willibald Gluck. The Bavarian-born Gluck achieved renown in Vienna for his operatic reforms and emphasis on musical dramatic honesty, and enjoyed great success in Paris in the last years of his life. He was not known for strong political views as the French Revolution started to brew, but by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, he had been embraced as a symbol of artistic resistance to the French in German-speaking regions, especially on account of his two Iphigenie operas, which articulated sacrifice on behalf of a nation at war and the overcoming of tyrannical forces. While Gluck's ghost makes an appearance in Hoffmann's fantastical tale, Gluck's Iphigenie operas from 1774 and 1779 respectively were performed throughout German-speaking regions through the first decades of the 19th century, atypical programming at a time when more recent operas tended to hold sway. Hoffmann himself oversaw a German performance of Iphigenie en Tauride in Dresden in April 1813, as conflict with Napoleon's forces raged nearby, literally within earshot. He wrote about hearing the sounds of warfare inside the theater, as Gluck's opera about the bloodthirsty inhabitants of the island of Taurus unfolded on stage. The context of Hoffmann's literary career, which strongly profiles music and musicians, and includes many fantastical tales of a psychological bent, invites us to recognize a strong political subtext. Based in the Prussian capital of Berlin, where he wrote Ritter Gluck and his Beethoven-based pieces, Hoffmann lived under the stifling conditions of French occupation. Following the crushing defeat by French forces at Jena-Auerstadt in 1806, Prussians wore a heavy cloak of shame. As a result, many Prussians began to envision reforms in various aspects of life that could restore dignity and strength. Ultimately, in 1813, as Napoleon turned his military attention from his failed Russian initiative to the fragmented German-speaking regions, Prussia declared war on France, gaining critical support from non-Prussian volunteer soldiers in the process. Revolutionary-minded thinkers and artists from Saxony proved key to this active resistance, which reached its culmination in battles at Dresden and Leipzig. Scholar Stephen Rumpf, in his close study of Hoffmann's writings from these years, urges us to dig below their fantastic idealistic surfaces. Beginning in 1813, many of Hoffmann's writings began to appear in collections that made them widely available. In particular, Rumpf has drawn attention to Hoffmann's reference to a, quote, kingdom not of this world, end quote, in the debate about the musical and visual arts, in which music, Hoffmann argues, speaks the higher language of the spirit kingdom, residing in the human heart alone. Hoffmann's kingdom not of this world references Christ's words to Pontius Pilate as he learns his earthly days are numbered, as recorded in the Gospel of John. Understood in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, Rumpf asserts, behind Hoffmann's ethereal Geisterreich, or spirit kingdom, lurks the sordid violence of the all too real kingdoms of this world. Kevin Carnes, in his scholarly studies, has emphasized how Hoffmann's otherworldly kingdom represents a spiritual utopia, an imaginary construct, a mindset, a psychological pathway to a new mode of being. For Beethoven, who also dealt with French occupation in Vienna and then Metternich's oppressive regime following the Congress of Vienna, this spiritual utopia was what he sometimes referred to as the empire of the mind. Although the defeat of Napoleon on German soil did not immediately lead to a democratic nation state, many liberal-minded thinkers maintained a sense of hope. Looking back on these tumultuous years in his 1870 Beethoven essay, Wagner referred to the early 19th century as a period of German rebirth. Beethoven is no longer alive in Wagner's 1840 Pilgrimage Tale, like Gluck in Hoffmann's story, nor is the young admiring pilgrim, the story, reportedly having been drawn from the surviving papers of the narrator. The visit takes us back in time to Beethoven's later years, when the Ninth Symphony was fully composed, yet still unknown. Significantly, the younger composer attends a performance of Fidelio while in Vienna. In conjunction with discussion of the texted finale of the Ninth, the imaginatively resurrected Beethoven addresses the genre of opera in ways we can recognize as pointing forward to Wagner's evolution as a composer for the lyric stage. In the novella, the chorale finale of the Ninth Symphony is considered a harbinger of a kind of musical drama that breaks free from convention, an aesthetic revolution that the fictional Beethoven identifies as the path he were to pursue were he to compose another opera. The novella's text is sprinkled with remarks slighting French, English, and Viennese musical tastes as superficial, while admitting they provided commercially viable outlets for composers like the young composer and Beethoven as well. The galop or galop, a brisk, energetic dance, is mentioned more than once. Schubert's creative output includes a couple of galops, as does Liszt's, such as the Galop de Bal, which was composed around the time of Tannhäuser's painting and Wagner's Beethoven novella, and which we will now hear. Composing music in this vein was but a means to an end for the young composer in Wagner's novella. His meaningful point of connection with the older Beethoven was as a poor yet ambitious German composer at odds with an artistically and politically complacent world. In real-life terms, Wagner's writing of the Pilgrimage novella punctuated the genesis of his libretto for The Flying Dutchman. With the French Grand Opera-styled Rienzi complete, but not yet performed, Wagner developed a prose scenario for his next opera and composed 3 standalone strophic songs, Senta's Ballad and the 2 male choral songs from Act 3. Wagner set these songs musically in order to pitch the work in advance of its completion. Although he managed to sell the story, Wagner soon abandoned the hopes of landing his Flying Dutchman as a total package on a Parisian stage with him as composer. Still, he pressed forth, and by May 1841, he had fleshed out a libretto which, it should be noted, does not include a single discrete strophic song satisfying the expectations of predictably repeated music and closure. Rather, all of the strophic songs in the opera are structurally altered, with deviations from convention linked to dramatic situations. Hence, the helmsman song in Act 1 breaks down, trailing off as he falls asleep, and the tenor picks up where he left off when he reawakens, completely unaware of the starkly contrasting musical and dramatic events that have happened in between, with the Dutchman arriving on shore. Then, in Act 2, Senta's ballad is foreshadowed by her humming the refrain. When she later sings the ballad ostensibly as a solo set piece, her initially resistant audience ends up joining her during the second refrain, drawn in as they are to her compelling story about the needy seafaring captain. Senta then collapses after the third stanza, overwhelmed, and takes the orchestra with her. The female chorus tries to keep the song going by singing the next refrain a cappella, before being surprised by Senta's sudden rejuvenation and an unanticipated coda in which she musically and dramatically liberates the Dutch sea captain from his cyclical return to the stormy seas. Senta later reclaims her defiant coda when she is with Eric, causing him great consternation. Let us now listen to the radically revised ending to Senta's ballad as it exists in the completed opera. In lieu of subtitles, a quick review of the relevant text is in order. So as you look at your screen now, you'll see Senta singing the third stanza and narrating the fate of the Dutchman. And then before the female chorus comes in, Wagner indicated in stage directions that he wished Senta to become overcome and to collapse seated into what he referred to as a grandfather's chair. And it's the exact same place that she began her ballad. So in excitement, she has stood up, and at this point, she collapses exhausted in the chair. And then she is rejuvenated and sings the coda, which really has no point or purpose in a typical strophic song because it takes away from the regular pattern of cyclical return. So now we'll listen to this performance from the Royal Opera House, directed by Tim Albury. Obviously, in this production, Senta does not physically collapse into an armchair, as Wagner's original stage directions suggest, but her temporary non-participation in the ballad is made clear when the chorus takes over without orchestral support. Wagner's revisions to the Dutchman text prior to composition shed light on a remark that the fictional Beethoven shares towards the end of the Pilgrimage novella. After denigrating himself as an opera composer, Beethoven sharply critiques the set pieces, the arias, duets, and trios that formulaically made up opera at the time, all examples of, quote, gleaming lies, glittering nonsense, and saccharine tedium. He then states, whoever wrote a true musical drama would be taken for a fool. Wagner's treatment of Senta's ballad and her psychic state later on, when Eric shares his dream with her, gained allusions to altered states of consciousness in the stage directions as the opera was published in piano vocal form in 1845. In the latter scene, Senta falls into a trance-like state as Eric revives aloud his dream about the arrival of the Dutchman. Wagner specifically referenced her state as akin to what was then known as magnetic sleep. Jeffrey Buller, your next webinar speaker, will be focusing on sleep in the ring, which takes many different forms. Today, taking our cue from Wagner's 1870 Beethoven essay, we will linger in part on states of being linked to dreams and clairvoyance, which are not bound up with sleep in a conventional sense. In his 1870 essay, Wagner relied heavily on the ideas of Arthur Schopenhauer in probing such matters, which he did at length. Yet both his prose works and operas indicate that the composer had been interested in such material as creative fodder for more than 2 decades before he first began to read Schopenhauer's work. Already in 1834, in Wagner's first completed opera Die Feen, or The Fairies, we find what is usually referred to as a mad scene, in which the mortal Prince Arundel recalls the fateful moment in which he hunted his shape-shifting wife in the form of a gazelle. His unsettled recollection takes on nightmarish deviations from reality when he imagines shooting the gazelle. The crux of the scene is the moment when the prince looks into the teary eyes of the wounded animal and develops a deep sense of compassion. Many of you might already have thought by way of association of the scene in Act 1 of Wagner's last opera, Parsifal, when Gurnemanz endeavors to show the intruder that he has thoughtlessly killed a swan, a living creature. Several other dramatic elements of Die Feen resurface in Wagner's later operas, surely part of the reason he gave the autograph score to Ludwig II and never sanctioned its performance or publication during his lifetime. Die Feen was to have its American professional main stage premiere last summer at Glimmerglass. It's a shame the production was canceled, and I hope the artistic director, Francesca Zambello, keeps a possibility of a future production in play. In lieu of a live performance, a virtual adaptation was created with animations by S. Katie Tucker. As Zambello also heads Washington National Opera, she had her fingers in the Beethoven pot as well last year, with plans to open the fall season with a new production of Fidelio. The company's response to canceling live performances has been inventive, with a range of alternative virtual programming pitched at all ages. As a running theme, Zambello seized upon the opening words of Leonora's aria, Come Hope, which have only gained in resonance in recent months. When Wagner first wrote about Beethoven in 1840, he was not so explicit about prophetic dreams and clairvoyance as he was to be in his 1870 essay. But the early novella's conceit is clearly dreamlike and rooted in wishful fantasy. The narrator's reference to Fidelio also reminds us of the significant scene at the top of Act 2, when the political prisoner Florestan imagines the arrival of his wife Leonora as an angel, casting a ray of light and hope, musically and psychologically, into Florestan's darkness. The dramatic device anticipates her actual arrival in the dungeon just moments later, when his waking vision comes true. Early 19th century references to magnetic sleep, as we find in Hofmann's short stories and Wagner's Dutchman, meant a kind of trance-like or hypnotic state, which was much under discussion in the wake of Franz Anton Mesmer's claims to have cured illnesses through his special magnetic powers. Sometimes called animal magnetism, the term mesmerism was widely adopted, and related practices proved to be stepping stones to hypnotism. Although Mesmer's narrow understanding of his therapeutic technique was debunked by a scientific panel in Paris that included Benjamin Franklin, we continue to use the verb mesmerize. Hofmann doubted mesmerism until he witnessed its effects firsthand. Along with many German writers and artists of the Romantic period, he probed the notion of the unconscious as mesmerism found its way into what we might call popular science. By the 1840s, hypnotism and conceptualizations of the unconscious had gained more solid analytical ground. A landmark study in this vein is Gustav Carus's Psyche, or Psyche, which was published in Dresden in 1846. Over a century later, in 1959, Carl Jung credited Carus for pointing to the unconscious as the essential basis of the psyche, based on scientific and medical evidence. Carus was a high-profile physician in Dresden as Wagner's career brightened significantly in the Saxon capital. While in no way wishing to force an association, we should note that Carus traveled in the same revolutionary-minded circle of artists in Dresden as did Wagner, having studied painting with Caspar David Friedrich and then Julius Schnorr von Karlsfeld, father of Ludwig, Wagner's first Tristan. A generation earlier than Wagner, Carus had attended the St. Thomas School in Leipzig. This is all to say that strong, influential currents of thought coursed through Wagner's life in Paris and his Dresden years, leading up to the revolutionary uprising in May of 1849. This basis did not disappear as Wagner subsequently went into exile, taking with him the complete score of Lohengrin and more than a head start on his Ring project. It is easy to consider these projects from the end phase of Wagner's time in Dresden as reflective of the lawless revolutionary that would spend years in exile. In my book, Wagner's Visions, shameless plug, through close examination of Wagner's artistic activities and development during these years, I have been reminded of the great value he attached to the earlier period of German rebirth. Wagner's attention to Gluck during this period is particularly revealing. In philosophical terms, Schopenhauer had already probed the relationship between the conscious and unconscious mind in his book, The World as Will and Representation, first published in Leipzig in the last months of 1818. The book, however, was a sleeper, going virtually unnoticed at first, noteworthy exceptions being Goethe and Jean-Paul, who both read it with great appreciation. The book still failed to attract a substantial audience when an expanded two-volume edition appeared in 1844. It was not until the 1850s that Schopenhauer's writings began to garner much attention, including Wagner's. Openly enthusiastic about Schopenhauer's ideas beginning in the fall of 1854, Wagner's only extensive discussion of those ideas is found in the Beethoven essay of 1870, written while the composer was based at Tribschen. Wagner's foreword to the Beethoven essay indicates that what he thought would be a commemorative address delivered live had become an essay instead, affording him the opportunity to expand his material in two main directions, to include his philosophical ideas about music and to offer a tribute to a German audience in the political military context of the Franco-Prussian War. The genesis of this essay, as shown in the accompanying slide, spanned a few weeks. With an outline completed sometime in the days just beforehand, Wagner wrote the essay between July 20th and September 7th. On the personal front, this was a pivotal period for Wagner and Cosima. Their third child, Siegfried, was born the previous summer. Shortly thereafter, Hans von Bülow finally conceded to a divorce, enabling Cosima to marry Wagner. The ceremony took place on August 25th, 1870, and Siegfried was baptized a few days later. Artistically, Wagner was focused on orchestrating Act 3 of Siegfried and upcoming work on the completion of Götterdämmerung. Politically, Wagner's conception of the essay coincides with the very days France mobilized its army, and the North German Federation responded in kind, with Bismarck's Prussia decidedly at the forefront. As Roger Allen has emphasized in his 2014 book, including a fresh translation of the Beethoven essay, Burgeoning anti-French sentiment left its mark on Wagner's text, especially after he had completed the initial outline. The alternate ending Wagner drafted in December took something of a step back from that stance, but was never substituted for the original ending. Wagner's first and relatively brief reference to Beethoven in the essay concerns his withdrawal of the dedication of the Eroica Symphony to Napoleon, following the French leader's coronation as emperor. As such, the shifting power balance between France and what would become the German nation, from the Napoleonic Wars through to the conflict of 1870 to 1871, is a core concern for Wagner, a trajectory that shifts from a position of shame and inferiority to one of cocky chauvinism. Wagner's own dark days of shame in Paris figure into this picture. Stanford professor Thomas Gray reminds us that Wagner's pamphlet, Judaism and Music, can be seen as something of a companion piece to his 1870 Beethoven essay, as Wagner reissued the 1850 pamphlet, originally published under a pseudonym, in 1869 under his own name. If, as Gray puts it, Jews were public enemy number one for Wagner, the French were enemy number two. In the pamphlet, successful Jewish German composers such as Meyerbeer and Mendelssohn were prime targets for Wagner, who often put himself forth as the misunderstood underdog, and a bitterly jealous one at that. The case of Meyerbeer was especially problematic for Wagner on account of his success in Paris and with French-influenced musical forms. In 1870, Wagner's prime target had shifted to Offenbach, another German-born Jewish composer whose success with the genre of operetta Wagner satirized in a libretto titled A Capitulation that remained unset musically, but ripely features Offenbach's famous infernal galop, or can-can. And here I recommend Gray's translation of Eine Kapitulation in the back of Richard Wagner and His World. Gray depicts Wagner's stance in 1870 as follows, quote, "The Prussian-led campaign against the French Second Empire was nothing less than a vindication of the deprivations and humiliations inflicted on him by a heartless and soulless Paris. During his failed attempts to achieve international recognition there in 1839 to 42, the Parisian Tannhäuser fiasco of 1861, and several brief, equally troubled encounters in between." He goes on, "If the protracted siege of Paris following the military defeat at Sedan was for Bismarck a political tactic to force diplomatic cooperation from the unstable government replacing Napoleon III, a tactic to which, to some extent, he regretted, Wagner experienced the siege as an act of personal vengeance, conveniently staged for him by the armies of the federated German states." Wagner's focus on music, musicians, and nationalism in his Beethoven essay includes a caution against one-to-one readings of biographical or political details as a means for interpreting music. Above all, he relies on Hoffmannesque emphasis on an ineffable musical kingdom not of this world. Wagner lingers on the emergence of a new breed of poets around the time of German rebirth, the period in which German-speaking regions resisted and finally triumphed over French forces in 1813. German forces, bolstered by troops of the Sixth Coalition, finally defeated Napoleon in October of 1813 at the so-called Battle of Nations outside Leipzig, when Wagner was just a few months old. In broaching a philosophical discussion of the arts at that time, Wagner contrasts Goethe with the more nationalistic and revolutionary Schiller, as allied with the visual or plastic arts in the case of Goethe, and poetry and drama in the case of Schiller. Turning to and prioritizing music, Wagner shifts the focus of the discussion to different dimensions of music, with Schopenhauer taking center stage. With Beethoven still but scarcely mentioned, Wagner expresses the necessity of understanding Schopenhauer's ideas in order to understand Beethoven's music. The philosophical framework of Wagner's ensuing discussion features several well-worn dualities with Kantian roots. such as inner versus outer consciousness, the external phenomenal world versus an inner noumenal one. Music's direct, unmediated expressive powers are celebrated as belonging to and emanating from an inner unconscious realm. Schopenhauer's engagement with this line of thinking becomes more distinctive when Wagner draws in his reflections on his theory of allegorical dreams, which translate unconscious impulses in ways that the conscious mind can perceive them. References to prophetic dreams and somnambulistic clairvoyance should ring bells in the mind of any Wagnerian. In Senta's Wake, we encounter Elsa, whose waking dream narration seems to summon Lohengrin's arrival. Wagner mentions specifically how somnambulists, known for the capacity to speak, although not displaying awareness of the physical world around them, may have their eyes open. This strange sleeping, waking state is how we find Hagen during his watch in Götterdämmerung, as well as in the surreal encounter with his father Albrecht later on, when he is repeatedly asked if he is sleeping. Schläfst du, Hagen, mein Sohn? As some of you will recall, Achim Freyer portrayed Hagen as a puppet to Albrecht's ventriloquist in his LA opera production, emphasizing the puppeteer's manipulation of his son's unconscious mind. As is generally known, Schopenhauer's grasp of the elements of music was rudimentary. In his 1870 essay, Wagner interprets, or rather translates, Schopenhauer's theories about allegorical dreams and clairvoyance so that they connect with practical musical elements such as harmony and rhythm. Following a brief summary of Wagner's ideas in this regard, we will consider three musical examples related to Tristan und Isolde. First, I wish to emphasize that mesmerism, clairvoyance, and Schopenhauer's allegorical dream state all challenge dualistic frameworks, such as outer versus inward perspectives or lightness versus darkness, either literally or metaphorically. Furthermore, while much ink has been spilled about the German fondness for metaphors of depth and darkness in the 19th century, clairvoyance challenges that view by championing an inner light that is reached beyond an initial engagement with darkness. This inner light or sphere of experience is often linked to a sort of universal unconscious beyond the individual unconscious, and must be mediated or assume forms perceptible to the waking conscious mind. In Schopenhauerian terms, this inner reality, which trumps the superficial concrete world of appearances, influences us by approaching perceptibility. In musical Wagnerian terms, harmony expresses the ineffable inner essence of things, while rhythm, melodic shaping, and even the distinctive timbres of different instruments enable music to become more physically defined and perceptible. In the most general ways of thinking, Wagner regarded music's ability to stretch from being amorphous and homogeneous to highly distinctive and physically shaped as superior to the expressive potential of the visual art or plastic arts or poetry. Let us now consider three Tristan-related examples. The first is the Lied Träume, Dreams, with text by Mathilde Wesendonck, which Wagner set to music in December of 1857 and became a study for a passage in Act 2 of his opera in progress. Let's briefly look at the text before hearing an arrangement for piano and string quartet. If you'll look at the verses of the text, by the time we get to the third stanza, the text refers to glorious rays penetrating the soul. So we see sort of this language that relates to this sort of Schopenhauerian way of viewing this spectrum of consciousness and unconsciousness, and the way that both parts of this world they can intersect and infuse each other in different ways. As we now listen to this performance with Donald Runnacles at the piano and Irene Roberts, California-born Irene Roberts, as the mezzo here, You'll notice that the performance was recorded in the Deutsche Oper in December, and the performers are not facing the auditorium, which is empty and has placeholder papers on the seats, but rather they're facing the back of the stage. And I have to say, I feel for these performers and athletes and all these folks who are accustomed to having audiences performing without much of a kind of communicative response, but the performance is stunning. So listen as you hear to the ways in which Wagner is trying to evoke not a world of the here and now, but a world of dreams. So in that particular musical setting, Wagner chose to have those gently pulsing chords in the background. You still can feel the bar line, so you still know that there's a rhythmic structure, But there's a sense of suspension. And in the third stanza, when it's referring to the glorious rays that penetrate the soul, Wagner treated it as a musical climax. So it's actually quite elevated and it sort of comes out of itself before at the end of the song, there's a fading or dying away. Now let us consider the related passage in Act 2 of the opera Tristan und Isolde, namely the duet O Sing her nieder. The passage comes after what can only be described as an extended debate, in which Tristan tries to convince Isolde that there is more to inner experiences, even death, than she has up until this point grasped. Following their cliched physical reunion under the cover of night, their debate is a bit prickly and complicated. But once they reach O Sing her nieder, there seems to be a deeply felt connection and an initial stage of shared understanding. And just as a sideline, this is the very first this is a performance of the very first production of Tristan and Isolde that I experienced at Bayreuth a couple of years earlier with both Siegfried Jerusalem and Waltraud Meyer. So as Wagner has moved from the initial song setting into an operatic setting in which it's not just about a dream that sort of expands your worldly experience and then contracts, but there's something more going on. Wagner plays with the rhythm here. So in the original, in the Wesendonck-Lieder, just bear with me, you've got a very regular pulse. So it's a regular rhythm there. And then as we switch to Tristan, we've got an irregular rhythm going on. And then the opening melody of O Singkehrnieder actually takes the original Tristan sonority, which is so pungent and biting, especially the way it's orchestrated, and rather naked at the beginning of the prelude, where you have, and then, which, if you want to respell it, and of course there's been a lot of talk about the Tristan chord, you can have it as an A flat minor chord with added sixth. And sure enough, at the beginning of O Singkehrnieder, we have so he actually takes the initial, that angst-ridden, tension-ridden chord and unfolds it linearly and with harmony softens it and makes it a very, very different world. Even more on point in terms of the model of consciousness and clairvoyance articulated in the Beethoven essay is Tristan's central contribution to the debate leading up to O Singkehrnieder. In the following passage, our last example, Tristan contrasts his experiences in the outer world of chivalry and duty to his deep inner bond with Isolde and the conflict between the two. In listening to this passage, take note of the evolution of a highly defined musical world to a more relaxed, amorphous one, which attains a special realm of light and repose before returning to reality. inner vision that Tristan reaches, actually, it's almost like a sinking into it in the middle of that particular excerpt, is the first time, for those of you interested in the harmonic structure of the work, as the first time that B major is intimated, and that's the concluding sonority of the work when we finally reach, you know, cadential resolution and all of that. But its intimation there is quite poignant. In Wagner's Beethoven essay, he does in fact discuss Beethoven as a man and a composer, and he places much value on Beethoven's ability to infuse traditional musical forms with an individualistic vision of hope. Towards the end of the essay, which at times rambles and covers so much ground as to become somewhat incoherent, Wagner begins to rein things in so that Beethoven returns to the stage. The pivot emerges after a discussion of the downside for the individual artist of popular currents of fashion, a throwback to the earlier Beethoven novella. While acknowledging obliquely the biblical origin of his subsequent quote, Wagner states, "Our kingdom is not of this world," as he asserts that music is now emerging from the chaos of modern civilization. He goes on to write, "We come from within, you from without. We derive from being, you from the appearance of things." While Wagner read widely, we know that his reference to an otherworldly kingdom had special meaning on account of its usage by Hofmann. Thus, as we have considered Beethoven's essay of Wagner's Beethoven essay of 1870, we come full circle back to Hofmann, whose sensitivity to music and politics remained meaningful to Wagner through to his later years. Schopenhauer may have helped sharpen Wagner's thinking about compositional means of conveying different states of consciousness, but the significance of those realms remains strongly rooted in the liberal, culturally focused mindset of Hofmann and others in the earliest decades of the 19th century. The militaristic German nation state that emerged victorious in 1871 was not the ideal Kulturnation that many envisioned as the goal of the Napoleonic Wars. If Wagner's abiding appreciation of Hofmann has sometimes gone under the radar in consideration of his 1870 Beethoven essay, so too has a telling moment during his last days, which was recorded in Cosima's diary. Wagner would not live to experience the first major retrospective of his artistic career, when nearly all of his works for the stage were mounted in a festival setting in Munich in the summer of 1888. Even Die Feen was produced its world premiere. Through this public celebration, Wagner was promoted as a shining example of the still new German nation, taking his place among a pantheon of artists, including Beethoven. However, 10 days before his death in 1883, Wagner sang the praises of another vision of Germany in the form of a patriotic war song from 1813. In doing so, he championed the struggle for democratic unification that had met with so many obstacles during his lifetime, acknowledging perhaps the compromise or gulf between those ideals and the modern German state. In any case, that song, Lützow's Wild Hunt, closes with a plea to remember the brave souls who died endeavoring to throw off the chokehold that Napoleon had on German-speaking regions. The author of that song's text was a Dresden-born poet and playwright, Theodor Körner, whose father was in fact the dedicatee of Schiller's Ode to Joy. Körner was the newly appointed dramaturg at Vienna's Burgtheater when he joined the Prussians to fight against Napoleon in 1813. Wounded during a secret attack by the French during a period of armistice, Körner was unable to recover. Upon his death, he became one of the Napoleonic War's greatest martyrs. Likely unknown to Wagner, but worth pondering, Körner met with Beethoven before joining the war effort, and they discussed a possible operatic collaboration that never materialized. One can only wonder what a second opera by Beethoven might have been like. Thank you. And now I'll turn the screen back to Terry, and a reminder of your next webinar, which will, I think, dovetail nicely. Jeffrey Buller's look at Sleep in the Ring. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine. It's always a delight to have you with us. It's been too long, and look to have you back again soon. I just wanted to introduce our next, whoops, we have a wrong date there. Our next webinar is on the 21st, Sunday the 21st. I think that's correct. Because Die Walküre is going to be screening on, wait a minute, maybe I am screwed up. At any rate, we moved it to Sunday. The next one will be on Sunday rather than on a Saturday, because the Ring Festival will be screening Die Walküre. So once Brunhilde goes to sleep, the next day we can learn all about sleep in the ring. So I wanted to open up for questions now. And so if anybody has questions, type them in the Q&A area, and we'll try to get to everybody. You know, remember, sometimes people's questions are similar. Do we have one? Okay, I answered that one already. Any questions? Put this away. No, I'm not seeing any questions out there right at the moment. Nobody has any questions? No? Is there anybody out? We've had someone ask if we could email the list of the books, and certainly I'll have a list of books available and push it out possibly with the next email goes out announcing the programs coming up.
I can also include titles that I mentioned if that's helpful.
Well, that might be helpful. I don't know if the person, we have some people are peeling out, so.
I have something to say, May I?
Yes, please do.
I'm so impressed with this talk because it weaves the background and the prevailing thinking and the new thinking at the time, and these upheavals on the political arena, and combines these incredible people, Hoffmann, Wagner, Beethoven, Schopenhauer. They all leaned on each other. Well, not Hoffmann, but they all gained much from each other and built upon it. It is an amazing overview of the time period that you gave us, Katherine. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma.
We have a question from Peter Felleman, one of our Wagnerians here in San Francisco. What is the text of the Kerner song last mentioned?
Oh, it's Lutov's Wild Hunt. I can actually send it to you as a file. It's a lyric that is found in a book of poetry that was published by Kerner's father and was one of the most reprinted books of poetry in the 19th century. And it opens actually with a poem called Die Eiche, the Oaks. And it's just littered with symbolically laden songs. But Lutov's Wild Hunt was set originally by Carl Maria von Weber, who set some of the other Kerner texts, and they became forbidden songs immediately. Because they were so popular, it was one of the reasons that Weber did not get a conducting post in Berlin, actually. And the songs were sung, including the Lutzow's Wild Hunt. And Lutzow was the head of a volunteer military unit that actually drew soldiers from all over Germany. So not just Prussia. So Saxon volunteer soldiers were actually fighting on behalf of Prussia, and in Saxony were fighting against their neighbors and friends. It was a very unusual situation. But it's easy to find it, and there are actually recordings of it with Weber's accompaniment available on YouTube as well.
Super. We have a question from Hannes Vogel down in Palo Alto. Any evidence of Liszt conveying to Wagner his recollection of his face-to-face encounter with Beethoven as a boy prodigy?
That I don't know, but given the amount of time that they spent together personally, I wouldn't doubt it. But I haven't come across any particular record of that. But I'm sure that that would be something that Wagner would have been interested in.
Do we have any other folks have questions? Go out there and
okay,
look.
you can go again.
I will go again. Okay. You know, I picked up Hoffman yesterday and started reading. I read Rita Gluck. I read in Russian. And whatever was in this book, I kept on reading. And he is so interestingly talks about composers before him. He was a composer himself, too. He says, Haydn romantically depicts humane in regular life. He is very close and accessible to the majority. Mozart is more engaged with the superhuman, wonderful, something that dwells in the depths of our soul. And Beethoven, the music by Beethoven moves the levers of fear, tremor, grief, and it awakens this infinite languishing in which the essence of romanticism lays. And this is my rough translation. He is, that's why he is a purely romantic composer, so on and so forth.
Well, and if you read what Wagner wrote in the 1870 essay, it echoes Hoffmann so well. He talks about Haydn, he talks about Beethoven in similar terms, I mean, Mozart in similar terms. And when he gets to Beethoven, he very much dwells on the aesthetic concept of the sublime, which in the 19th century had different dimensions. So there's the fear, the trembling, the awe. But for somebody like Jean Paul, who wrote the introduction to Hoffmann's collection that was published in 1814 and 15, there's a wonderful passage in Jean Paul's formulation of the sublime. And it wasn't just sort of the mountains and the majestic things that are so beyond our ability to process, but he also said it could be just the tiniest shudder on the Buddha's body that could also could evoke the sublime. So they were really interested in those kind of different dimensions, but for Wagner, it was all about the sublime. And again, echoing Hoffmann from 1810. It's just remarkable.
Is the fourth step in this progression that Hoffmann describes after Beethoven.
Remarkable. Great indebtedness there.
Yeah. He also.
Oh, nothing. Go ahead. Keep with your conversation.
He also writes, the music is the most romantic of all arts. Maybe it will be true to say that it's the only really romantic form of art because its subject is the eternity. The lyre of Orpheus opened the gates of hell. How about that? It gives me the shivers.
It does. It does.
It does. Yeah.
Well, I want to just give a shout out to a couple of Wagner Society members. We have Dale Bilsand from the Wagner Society of Scotland. And we also have Jose Padilla down in Mexico. So it's great to have our people far and wide. I think we had some Canadians.
Yay for the Canadians, out and about.
Canadians, yes. If you could hear the oot and the boots from Catherine, you'll know that she is a Canadian, born Canadian. Do we have any other questions, anybody?
Somebody raised hand, Michael Rupert.
Oh, let me look and see what he raised, see what he's got out there, Michael.
Yeah.
Let me close this little guy here. There's all these buttons I have to deal with here. In Q's and A's, no, he'd be out in participants with the hand up, Michael. Let's see. Is he under Rupert Michael? It's weird how they thread these things. I don't see your hand up there. Let's see. Let me look there. Attendees with, I'm not getting that hand raised. Oh, here it is. I just wanted to say hi from the Wagner Society of the Upper Midwest. Thank you, Michael. Michael's one of our newest members. I believe he joined yesterday. Then we had another new person today join, which is absolutely great. We can't do it without you folks. So
greetings and stay warm.
Yeah, and I forgot Martin Smullen from South African from Johannesburg. So thank you for that. I appreciate you reminding me that. So let's see, I might have another question. No, another chat. No, it looks like that's it for everybody. It's been an absolutely terrific afternoon. Thank you so much, Katherine. It was just delightful. Always new nuggets of information as we as a group plumb the depths of Wagner. So thank you
again for the invitation, and I hope we can all meet in person sometime.
Oh, I'm hoping that's going to happen soon too.
And get back into the theaters.
Yes, that too. So I want to thank everybody for attending today. It's been a pleasure having you with us. Please join us next month for Jeffrey Buller. If you haven't heard him before, you'll love him. He's extremely witty and alliterative. He always has alliterative pieces to his talks, and they're always delightful. So with that, I will bid everyone adieu. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you next time. So live vol.